There's a misunderstanding in modern culture that if someone is not highly visible, they must be insecure. If they're not posting their face, their lifestyle, their victories, their appearance, then something must be missing. But that assumption reveals more about the culture than it does about the person being judged. Because for many empaths, the absence of self-display is not a symptom of low confidence. It is often the opposite. It can be the result of a mind that has moved beyond the need for constant external reinforcement. And this is where psychology becomes interesting. Most people have been conditioned to confuse attention with worth. Somewhere along the way, visibility became tied to identity. The more people see you, the more significant you appear to be. The more approval you receive, the more secure you must be. And social media, by design, amplifies this belief. It turns validation into a measurable system. Likes become social proof. Comments become emotional rewards. Views become a distorted form of status. But empaths often experience this dynamic differently, because empaths tend to be unusually aware of emotional undercurrents. They don't just see the surface exchange, someone posting a photo and others responding. They often perceive the invisible transaction beneath it, the need for affirmation, the performance hidden inside self-presentation, the unconscious bargaining that says, see me, approve of me, tell me I matter. And for a deeply self-aware empath, that can feel exhausting. Not because they believe posting is wrong, but because they often resist attaching their identity to public reaction. This is a critical distinction. An empath who doesn't post their photos may not be rejecting connection. They may be rejecting dependency. There is a profound difference between wanting to be seen and needing to be validated. And many empaths have spent enough of their lives being emotionally attuned to others that they begin to value something. Rare in identity, untouched by outside opinion. Think about how unusual that is in a culture built on performance. Most people are taught to build an image. Empaths often feel compelled to protect a reality because they understand something others miss. The more identity becomes fused with public approval, the easier it is to lose yourself. Once your sense of worth depends on response, you become vulnerable to emotional outsourcing. Your confidence rises and falls based on who notices you. Your peace becomes negotiable. Your self-image becomes partly owned by strangers. And empaths, especially mature empaths, often sense the danger in that. They would rather be rooted than admired. They would rather be authentic than impressive, and sometimes they would rather be unknown than misunderstood. This often comes from a deeper philosophical orientation. Empaths frequently value essence over appearance, substance over display, meaning over spectacle, and when someone values inner coherence, more than outer recognition, public self-promotion can start to feel strangely irrelevant. Because if you know who you are, what exactly are you trying to prove? That question unsettles people. Because much of modern behavior is built on proving attractiveness, proving success, proving happiness, proving relevance. But empaths often begin stepping away from systems that require constant proof, not out of superiority, out of liberation. They stop performing identity and start inhabiting it. And that changes everything. You'll notice many emotionally intelligent people become increasingly private as they grow. That's not withdrawal. That's refinement. They realize not every truth needs broadcasting. Not every moment needs witnesses. Not every part of the self belongs in public. And perhaps most importantly, not all value increases when exposed. Some things deepen in privacy. Peace deepens in privacy. Self-trust deepens in privacy. Clarity deepens in privacy. And empaths often understand this intuitively. There's another layer most people overlook. Many empaths are highly sensitive to comparison culture. Not because they are intimidated by others, but because they recognize how destructive comparison is to the human psyche. They see what happens when identity becomes a competition, when people begin curating life instead of living it, when self-worth gets trapped in a cycle of measuring, performing, and chasing emotional rewards. And many empaths quietly opt out. That is not passivity. That is psychological independence. It is the refusal to let technology dictate self-perception. It is the refusal to turn identity into a product. And in a world increasingly obsessed with being witnessed, there is extraordinary power in becoming self-defined. That power is often misunderstood. Silence gets mistaken for insecurity. Privacy gets mistaken for weakness. Restraint gets mistaken for absence. But some of the most secure people in the world have no interest in constant visibility, because they are no longer hungry for what attention feeds. They have found nourishment elsewhere, in purpose, in inner peace, in real relationships, in self-respect, and that is something algorithms cannot measure. In fact, one of the strongest signs of inner stability is the ability to exist without announcing yourself, to know your worth without displaying it, to possess depth without packaging it, to remain whole without applause. That is not social detachment. That is freedom. And for many empaths, not posting their photos is a quiet expression of that freedom, a silent declaration that identity is not a performance. That worth does not require witnesses. That presence is not diminished by privacy. And maybe this is what unsettles others most. Because when someone no longer needs validation, they become difficult to control. They cannot be manipulated by approval. They cannot be easily drawn into comparison. They cannot be seduced by superficial recognition. And that kind of psychological sovereignty is rare, but it is real, and many empaths live it quietly, not because they are hiding, because they have stopped confusing visibility with value. And that may be one of the most radical acts of self-possession in the modern world, because the moment you stop asking the world to confirm your worth is the moment you begin to fully own it. Once you understand that many empaths don't avoid visibility because they lack confidence, the next question becomes far more interesting. Why do so many of them actively protect their privacy? And this is where most people miss the deeper psychology, because privacy for an empath is often not about hiding. It's about protection. Highly sensitive people tend to experience exposure differently than others. What feels casual to one person can feel invasive to an empath. What seems like harmless sharing to most can feel, to a deeply perceptive mind, like opening a door that may be difficult to close. Empaths often don't just think in terms of information. They think in terms of energy. And whether you interpret that psychologically, emotionally, or philosophically, the pattern remains the same. They are acutely aware that when you reveal yourself, you invite interpretation. And interpretation is never neutral. The moment an image is posted, it does not remain yours alone. It enters the perceptions, projections, judgments, envy, admiration, resentment, assumptions, and unconscious narratives of other people. Most people overlook this. Empaths often feel it immediately, and this sensitivity changes how they relate to self-disclosure, because they understand something subtle but profound. Not everyone looking at you is looking at you with clean intentions. Some observe with comparison. Some observe with envy. Some observe with hidden hostility. Some observe searching for weakness. And some perhaps most dangerously observe looking for access. Empaths, particularly those who have been manipulated, betrayed, or emotionally exploited in the past, often become highly aware of this. And awareness changes behavior. A person who has learned that visibility can attract intrusion does not treat privacy casually. They treat it as a boundary, and boundaries, psychologically speaking, are one of the clearest signs of emotional health. This is important because people often misread guardedness. They call it withdrawal. They call it fear. They call it avoidance. But what they may actually be seeing is discernment. And discernment is not the same as distrust. It is the ability to distinguish what deserves access from what does not. That is wisdom. And empaths often develop this wisdom through painful experience, because many empaths spend years overexposing themselves emotionally. They give too much, reveal too much, trust too quickly, assume others have the same sincerity they do, and then reality teaches them otherwise. They encounter gossip, projection, manipulation, people who study their vulnerabilities, people who use personal openness as leverage. And after enough of these experiences, a shift occurs. The empath stops seeing openness as always virtuous and begins seeing selectivity as necessary. This is a profound psychological evolution, because immature sensitivity often leaks, mature sensitivity protects. And that protection often looks like privacy. Sometimes it looks like not posting personal photos. Sometimes it looks like keeping important moments off public platforms. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let strangers have effortless access to the intimate details of your existence. Not because you fear being seen, because you have become intentional about who gets to see you. There is enormous power in that, especially in a culture that treats exposure as normal. We live in a time where oversharing is often framed as authenticity, but authenticity without boundaries is not authenticity. It is vulnerability without discernment. And empaths, when they mature, begin understanding the difference. They recognize that not every observer deserves entry into their inner or outer world. That realization changes everything, because once privacy becomes a form of self-respect, silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling sovereign. And there is another layer here most people never consider. Empaths are often deeply aware of emotional residue, the psychological after effects of interaction, the exhaustion that follows unnecessary exposure, the strange heaviness that can come from feeling watched, interpreted, or energetically entangled in the perceptions of too many people. Others may dismiss this. Empaths often live it. And whether we frame it through neuroscience, emotional sensitivity, or interpersonal dynamics, there is evidence for this. Highly sensitive individuals process social stimuli more deeply. They often experience judgment more intensely. They can ruminate longer over criticism. They can feel relational tension others barely register. So what appears to outsiders as overprotectiveness may actually be a rational response to heightened processing. In other words, they are not avoiding damage imagined. They are preventing damage anticipated. That is not weakness. That is psychological intelligence. And the strongest people often understand prevention better than reaction. They don't wait to repair repeated harm. They structure life to reduce unnecessary harm in the first place. That is what boundaries do. That is what privacy does. And this is why many empaths do not confuse accessibility with kindness. They do not believe being open to everyone is a virtue. They understand that unrestricted access invites chaos, and chaos has a way of draining the sensitive. So they become selective, deliberately, quietly, sometimes invisibly, and others misread that as distance. But often, it is discipline, because privacy is not always about keeping others out. Sometimes it is about keeping yourself intact. That may be the deeper truth. To protect your peace is not selfish. To limit unnecessary exposure is not paranoia. To decide that some parts of your life remain sacred is not antisocial. It is self-governance. And psychologically, self-governance is one of the highest forms of maturity. The person who can decide what to reveal, what to withhold, who receives access, and where their emotional boundaries begin, that person is not hiding. That person is conscious. And consciousness always looks strange to people operating unconsciously. That is why empaths are often misunderstood. Their restraint is mistaken for insecurity. Their privacy is mistaken for secrecy. Their boundaries are mistaken for walls. But walls isolate, boundaries preserve, and knowing the difference can transform a life. Because the truth is, every empath eventually faces this decision. Will I keep making myself endlessly accessible to prove I am open, or will I protect what is valuable because I know it matters? That is not. They don't a small choice. That is the difference between emotional depletion and emotional sovereignty. And perhaps the deepest lesson here is this: what you protect reveals what you believe is precious. If an empath protects their peace, their image, their inner world, their private life, perhaps it is not because they fear the world. Perhaps it is because they finally understand their own value. And the moment you stop treating privacy as hiding, you begin to see it for what it often is: the intelligent defense of something sacred. Once you understand that many empaths are not avoiding visibility and they are not merely protecting privacy, a deeper pattern starts to emerge. For many of them, the decision not to constantly post their lives is tied to something even more fundamental. They are often more interested in experiencing life than performing it. And that distinction may be one of the great psychological divides of our time. Because modern culture has quietly trained people to confuse documentation with participation, to believe that if a moment is not shared, it somehow matters less, that if an experience is not displayed, it is incomplete, that if others do not witness it, it loses significance. But empaths often resist this logic instinctively, because they tend to relate to life through presence, not performance. And those are radically different ways of existing. Performance asks, how will this appear? Presence asks, how fully am I living this? Performance turns moments outward. Presence turns awareness inward. And empaths often feel the tension between those two modes very strongly, because the moment you begin curating an experience for observation, something subtle changes. Attention splits. Part of you is no longer immersed in the moment. Part of you has stepped outside the moment to manage perception, to frame it, to package it, to anticipate response. And many empaths feel that fracture. They sense how quickly living can become presenting, and they resist it. This is not accidental. It often emerges from a psychological orientation toward depth. Empaths tend to value felt experience over symbolic representation. They often care more about what something means than how it looks, more about emotional reality than social optics. And this makes performative culture feel strangely hollow to them, because much of social media is built on transforming life into image. But empaths often prefer life before it becomes image. They want the unmediated experience, the quiet conversation no one else hears, the sunset no camera interrupts, the personal victory no audience applauds, the moment that exists fully without being converted into content. And there is something profoundly philosophical in that, because it raises a question most people never ask: at what point does documenting life begin interfering with living it? That question matters, because once identity becomes tied to display, experience can become instrumental. Moments stop being lived for their own sake. They start being collected for presentation. And when that happens, something essential can be lost: the sacredness of immediacy, the intimacy of presence, the fullness of undivided attention. Empaths often guard those things fiercely, because they understand consciously or intuitively that attention is life. Where attention goes, existence is shaped. And if attention is constantly redirected towards self-presentation, something deeper can erode: inner stillness, authenticity, contact with reality as it is rather than as it appears. This is why many empaths reject the pressure to turn personal existence into ongoing public performance, not because they are detached from the world, because they are trying to stay connected to what is real, and in many ways that is increasingly rare. There is another psychological dimension here that deserves attention. Empaths are often deeply uncomfortable with self-objectification, with reducing the self into something to be consumed, something to be evaluated, something arranged for approval. And this discomfort can be difficult to articulate because most people have normalized it, but empaths often feel it. They sense when identity begins to become product, when personhood begins becoming brand, and many quietly step away from that because they do not want to become performers in a marketplace of perception. They want to remain human. That may sound simple. It is not. In a culture built on spectacle, remaining unperformed is an act of resistance, and empaths often practice that resistance without ever naming it, by choosing not to post every achievement, by keeping joy private, by letting experiences belong to themselves rather than to an audience, and perhaps most importantly, by refusing to confuse attention with meaning. That refusal changes how life is lived, because when you stop asking, how will this be perceived, you can return to asking, what is this moment asking me to? Experience, that is a radically different orientation, and it leads to a different kind of life, a slower life, a deeper life, a less performative life, a life where meaning is not dependent on witness. And many empaths are drawn to that, even if they cannot fully explain why. They simply know constant performance drains them. It feels false, fragmented, emotionally expensive, so they step out of it, quietly, deliberately. And others sometimes misread this. They assume the empath is disengaged, detached, socially absent. But often the opposite is true. The empath may be more engaged with reality than those documenting it, because they are not dividing themselves between experience and projection. They are simply there, present. And present, psychologically speaking, is one of the rarest and most powerful human capacities. Presence sharpens perception, deepens relationships, strengthens intuition, restores peace. And empaths often prioritize it over visibility. That is not avoidance. That is value alignment. It is choosing being over appearing, and that may be one of the most profound choices a person can make, because eventually everyone faces a question the digital world keeps trying to answer for them. Is your life something to be lived or something to be displayed? Most never pause long enough to consider the difference. Empaths often do. And that pause changes them. It makes them more selective, more inwardly anchored, less impressed by spectacle, less willing to trade depth for attention. And in many cases, that is exactly why they do not feel compelled to post themselves constantly, because they are busy inhabiting a life, not curating one. And maybe this is what the world needs to remember. Not every meaningful life is highly visible. Not every fulfilled person is highly displayed. Not every powerful presence seeks recognition. Some of the deepest people you will ever meet are not performing themselves at all. They are simply living, fully, quietly, real. And there is extraordinary strength in that, because in an age where nearly everyone is being pulled toward performance, the person who remains present becomes revolutionary. The person who refuses to turn every moment into evidence becomes free. And the person who lives for the depth of experience rather than the optics of experience may be the one who understands life most clearly. Because what you refuse to perform may be what you have finally learned to truly possess. And once you understand that many empaths do not avoid posting because they lack confidence, that they protect privacy as a boundary, and that they often choose presence over performance, a final layer reveals itself, one that is often the most misunderstood of all. Sometimes what looks like withdrawal is actually self-respect. And this is where the psychology becomes even deeper, because there are empaths who were once open, very open, people who shared freely, trusted easily, posted more, explained themselves often, made themselves emotionally and personally accessible, and then life taught them something, not through theory, through pain, through betrayal, through manipulation, through being misunderstood in moments they were sincere, through discovering that visibility can attract not only admiration, but projection. Not only connection, but exploitation. And when that realization lands deeply enough, something changes. The empath becomes more discerning. But from the outside, discernment often looks like distance. And that is where people get it wrong, because they assume the person became cold, guarded, detached. But often what actually happened is far more sophisticated. The person developed standards. And standards, especially after pain, are often the architecture of self-respect. This matters because many people interpret reduced openness as damage. But sometimes reduced openness is wisdom. Sometimes the person posting less, revealing less, exposing less has not become wounded. They have become awake. They have recognized a hard truth. Not everyone who gains access to you deserves access to you. That realization changes behavior, and it should, because maturity is not remaining equally open after every betrayal. Maturity is adjusting what you permit. And empaths often do this in powerful but quiet ways. They stop over-explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop offering emotional transparency to people who weaponize vulnerability. They stop making themselves easily readable to those who study openness for leverage. And yes, sometimes they stop posting personal photos, not because they fear being seen, because they have learned the cost of being casually exposed. There is enormous psychological intelligence in that, because self-respect often begins the moment you stop offering yourself where you are repeatedly mishandled. That is not bitterness. That is evolution. And many empaths evolve precisely because they have been hurt. Pain, when integrated, sharpens perception. It reveals patterns. It exposes false intimacy. It teaches the difference between attention and care, between curiosity and concern, between people who celebrate your light and people who quietly resent it. Empaths often learn these distinctions late, but once learned, they are not easily forgotten. And this is where many people misinterpret the empath who has grown quieter. They see less sharing and assume insecurity. They see less visibility and assume withdrawal. But they may actually be witnessing someone who has stopped confusing access with connection. Someone who has stopped believing openness must be unconditional. Someone who has begun treating their presence as something valuable. And valuable things are not scattered carelessly. They are protected. This is a profound shift, because early in life, many empaths believe love means unlimited availability, unlimited understanding, unlimited emotional access. But eventually, if they mature, they discover something more balanced. Love without boundaries invites exploitation. Compassion without discernment invites depletion. Openness without standards invites misuse. And once this becomes clear, the empath often changes dramatically, not in essence, in structure. Their heart may remain open, but the gates become intelligent, and that intelligence can look like silence, privacy, reduced exposure, even strategic invisibility. But none of that necessarily reflects fear. Sometimes it reflects mastery, because one of the highest forms of self-respect is no longer making yourself easy to consume, no longer placing your identity in spaces that reduce it, no longer offering intimacy to audiences incapable of honoring it. And in a world addicted to accessibility, that can appear rebellious. But it may actually be healthy, because psychologically, The ability to withdraw from what diminishes you is not weakness, it is strength. The ability to say, not everyone gets this part of me, that is strength. The ability to decide my peace matters more than public presence, that is strength. The ability to stop performing openness for people who misuse it, that is strength. And many empaths arrive at this strength only after surviving what tried to break them, which makes it hard-earned, deeply earned. And perhaps this is why the quiet empath is often more powerful than people realize. Because what looks like retreat may actually be restraint. What looks like distance may actually be discipline. What looks like disappearance may actually be self-possession. And self-possession is rare. It means you belong to yourself again. Not to public opinion, not to outside projections, not to the expectations of people demanding access, to yourself. That is a profound recovery, and it often begins when an empath stops asking, how can I be more acceptable? And starts asking, what deserves access to me at all? That question changes everything. Because once your life is organized around what deserves access rather than who demands it, you become much harder to manipulate, much harder to drain, much harder to define from the outside. And that is where inner power begins, not in domination, in discernment, not in withdrawal, in refusal to be misused. And maybe that is the deeper truth hidden beneath the empath who no longer posts the way they once did. Maybe you are not witnessing someone who has become smaller. Maybe you are witnessing someone who has stopped making themselves available to what makes them small. That is not collapse. That is self-respect taking form. And in many cases, it is the beginning of real freedom. Because the moment you stop treating reduced access as loss, you begin seeing it as what it may actually be, the quiet boundary where dignity begins. And never forget this, the people who reveal the least are not always hiding. Sometimes they have simply learned that what is sacred loses power when offered to everyone.